Hello, and thanks for joining me. What then should be our approach in apologetics? It should be something like this. My friend, I know Christianity is true because God's Spirit lives in me and assures me that it is true. And you can know it too because God is knocking at the door of your heart, telling you the same thing. If you are sincerely seeking God, then God will give you assurance that the gospel is true. Now, to try to show you it's true, I'll share with you some arguments and evidence that I really find convincing. But should my arguments seem weak and unconvincing to you, that's my fault, not God's. It only shows that I'm a poor apologist, not that the gospel is untrue. Whatever you think of my arguments, God still loves you and holds you accountable. I'll do my best to present good arguments to you, but ultimately you have to deal not with arguments, but with God Himself. That, of course, is one of the more infamous passages from the infamous first chapter of William Lane Craig's magnum opus, Reasonable Faith. I'm going to be presenting more quotes from that chapter in a moment, so if you're already familiar with the material, you can skip to the next chapter. But it does provide important context for what we're going to talk about today. In the past, I've discussed the most infamous passage from that book, the Should a Conflict Arise passage. Both that passage and the one just mentioned treat Christianity as a foregone conclusion. Craig makes it clear that his goal is to open the heart of the unbeliever to accept Christianity for emotional reasons, via the indirect method of opening their mind. But at the same time, he is closing off any possibility of the unbeliever doing the same to him. Now, from Craig's point of view, this double standard is perfectly justified. But how? Well, earlier in the chapter, Craig writes, I've already said that it is the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit that gives us the fundamental knowledge of Christianity's truth. Therefore, the only role left for argument and evidence to play is a subsidiary role. I think Martin Luther correctly distinguished between what he called the magisterial and ministerial uses of reason. The magisterial use of reason occurs when reason stands over and above the gospel like a magistrate and judges it on the basis of argument and evidence. The ministerial use of reason occurs when reason submits to and serves the gospel. In light of the Spirit's witness, only the ministerial use of reason is legitimate. Philosophy is rightly the handmaid of theology. Reason is a tool to help us better understand and defend our faith. Now, what does Craig mean by reason submitting to and serving the gospel? By submitting to, I think he means treating the gospel as a foregone conclusion. Reason is not allowed, in Craig's view, to judge whether the gospel is true. By serving the gospel, I think he partly means determining how, given that the gospel is true, other things can also be true, but I think he mostly means determining how to convince other people to become Christians. Craig continues, if the arguments of natural theology and Christian evidences are successful, then Christian belief is warranted by such arguments and evidences for the person who grasps them, even if that person would still be warranted in their absence. Such a person is doubly warranted in his Christian belief in the sense that he enjoys two sources of warrant. Now, we are not warranted by the Holy Spirit, of course, in our refusal to accept theism. But, and I cannot emphasize this enough, Craig is not warranted by it either. He thinks he is. He is positive that he is, but he is wrong. If there is no Holy Spirit, then there is no Holy Spirit to offer warrant. What's more, Craig is culpably wrong, since he is educated enough to know that strong religious experiences, even religious experiences that seem self-authenticating to those who have them, can and do have causes that need have nothing to do with the actual existence of a God. And there is simply no non-question-begging reason to believe that his own experience is any different. Now, if there were corroboration for those experiences being veridical to the existence of the Holy Spirit in the form of argument and evidence, that would be a different story. But Craig makes it clear that the kind of experience that he is talking about is sufficient all by itself. While he believes, again wrongly, that argument and evidence in favor of God's existence provides a second warrant for belief, it is not necessary, since those who are unacquainted with argument and evidence are nonetheless justified by their experience. The experience by itself, without any argument or evidence, is sufficient warrant in Craig's view. So if it must be supplemented by argument and evidence to the effect that the experience is veridical to the Holy Spirit, then it is not an experience of the Holy Spirit, since an actual experience of the Holy Spirit is sufficient without argument and evidence. Craig says that this is cause to say that all Christians are justified by their experience. But I say that if Craig were reasonable, this should compel him to say that no Christian is justified by their experience, because it leads to a contradiction. The experience is sufficient in the absence of corroboration, and the experience cannot be sufficient in the absence of corroboration. So the fact that we are not warranted by the Holy Spirit is not a disadvantage to atheism, since neither is anyone else. This means that if anything warrants Christian belief, it is the same as that which warrants Christian non-belief, reason and evidence. And the fact that we atheists give reason a primary role rather than a subsidiary role in our epistemology, the fact that we happily and proudly subject our non-belief to magisterial reason should give any neutral observer their first clue as to who is more likely correct. With that settled, I want to come to the thesis of this video, and it may be a bit startling. Without accepting Craig's premise that the ministerial use of reason must always prevail over the magisterial use of reason, I think we can and should explore the possibility that there is a place for ministerial reason in the cause of atheism. That is to say, there is a context, in fact, a large set of contexts, in which we should treat atheism as a foregone conclusion. If we treat atheism as a foregone conclusion, then ministerial reason would, as Luther and Craig would say, submit to and serve that conclusion. By submit to, I mean that it would take an observed phenomenon about the world, such as the fact that the cosmological constants of the universe are precisely what are needed in order to support our particular kind of life, and it would ask, how do we reconcile this phenomenon with the fact that gods do not exist? And then we can explore the different possible answers, the multiverse hypothesis, the deterministic hypothesis, and so on, weigh them against each other and decide which is most reasonable. Wait a minute, a theist might protest. Aren't we arbitrarily eliminating the theistic hypothesis from consideration? Eliminating it? Yes. Arbitrarily eliminating it? No. Because adopting ministerial reason does not mean that we have discarded magisterial reason. We reject Craig's premise that the magisterial use of reason is illegitimate. We embrace magisterial reason. We have used magisterial reason in the process of rejecting theism. And, this part is crucial, we may well use it again to reconsider theism if new evidence or new arguments come to our attention. But, having given the theistic hypothesis fair consideration, and being aware that life is short, we now choose the ministerial use of reason in support of our atheism. Jeffrey J. Lauder, co-founder of Internet Infidels, once wrote, in the context of the so-called problem of evil, that he was half tempted to refer to all arguments for the existence of God not as arguments but as problems, and more specifically as emotional problems. So the Kalam cosmological argument would become the emotional problem of Kalam cosmology without God. I don't think we need to stoop to calling all such problems emotional problems, unless they're the type of theist who says that unbelief is always an emotional problem, in which case...
That's fair, isn't it? You don't want to be hypocrites, do you?
But if we are taking the non-existence of gods as a given, then there's no reason not to refer to, say, the argument for morals as the problem of morality without God. Or, as moral philosophers put it,
oh, that's all we get day in, day out around this place. Come into my office.
Here is an example of a serious work of moral philosophy. It's an anthology with 22 different contributors, each a highly respected and credentialed philosopher, each with their own idea about what morals are or whether they even exist. There are no Christian apologists in the volume, and as I read through it, I have yet to find a single substantial mention of God. When we immerse ourselves into philosophy of religion, we tend to forget that there are other branches of philosophy whose practitioners are either atheists or theists who have put their theism to one side in the same way that theistic scientists do. I also have on my shelf a philosophy of science textbook. It too lacks any mention of God, although it does mention creationism as an example of pseudoscience. Philosophy of language, no God there. Philosophy of mind, no God there. Symbolic logic, don't make me laugh. There is so much richness in all these fields of philosophy. And when our first instinct upon encountering a theory is to measure it up against the theism-atheism dichotomy, we risk giving philosophy of religion more time than, frankly, it deserves. And I speak as someone whose YouTube channel is dedicated to the philosophy of religion. There is another reason for using ministerial reason when not considering new evidence. The reason that Craig, as a practical matter, can get away with relegating reason to a subsidiary role, and in a book called Reasonable Faith no less, is that his grounds for doing so are established in culture. Christianity is mainstream. Belief in the Holy Spirit is mainstream. Except for a few iconoclast theologians, Christians take for granted the idea that believing that you are communing with the Holy Spirit is sufficient rational warrant for Christianity. But we have long since reached the point where non-belief also enjoys establishment. After Christianity and Islam, it is the third largest religious viewpoint in the world. There are places and situations, and their number is significant, where the idea of the non-existence of God is as natural as breathing. Why should we not act like it? Why should we not say, this is our starting point and will remain so in the absence of new evidence? Why, in short, should we not treat atheism as established? Because we are still a minority? So is Islam, and they treat Allah as established. Christians and Muslims alike ask, how do we reconcile evil or evolution or divine hiddenness with what we already believe to be true? And they give lectures, and they have coffeehouse discussions, and they appear on TV, and they appear on YouTube, and they start with their religious belief and go from there. And there is nothing strange about it, because those beliefs are established in culture. There was a time, and frankly not that long ago, when the same was not true of us. That time is past. Non-belief, whether you call it atheism or not, is established. Non-belief is mainstream. Non-belief is a cultural force. But to remain that way and to grow, we need to act like it. So far I've been talking about ministerial reason in the sense of submitting to atheism or treating atheism as a foregone conclusion. What about in the other sense, in the sense of serving atheism? Does that mean to deconvert as many people as possible from their religion? I don't think so. I think that enterprise would have to use the magisterial use of reason, the kind that sits in judgment over both worldviews, theism and atheism, and asks which one is more likely to be true. And to reiterate again, unlike Craig's view, in which only the ministerial use of reason is legitimate, there will always be a place in atheism for both magisterial and ministerial reason. Ministerial reason in Counter-Apologetics would seek to show why apologetics are not dialectically effective, that is to say, why they do not succeed in persuading an atheist to change their views. A Christian who has read Craig might believe, as he does, that unbelief is always an emotional problem, for which the use of intellect is merely a smokescreen. They will have read that the unbeliever loves darkness rather than light, and wants nothing to do with God. But consider this. By reacting to the arguments defensively, that is, by showing that the atheist can have rational warrant for their atheism even in light of what the apologist points to as evidence for God, we do not pass judgment openly on whether he himself is irrational for believing that the argument is true. Without this threat, without triggering this knee-jerk reaction that most people get when they feel their worldview is in danger, we can instead focus on impressing them with our use of reason and show them that it is not a smokescreen, that it is in fact something we value very highly. When the apologist notices that we are treating, say, the problem of apparent design as a problem, not as an argument for the existence of God, and asks us to consider it as such, our job would then be to tell them that that is the magisterial use of reason, which sits over our worldviews like a judge and decides which one is correct or not. We should then tell them that we have used magisterial reason in the past to decide whether atheism is likely true in the first place. We should tell them that we stand ready to use it again if we hear arguments and evidence that we have not already heard and considered. And then we should shut up. Because if they are able to fill in the blanks themselves, then they actually have a chance of believing it. Make no mistake, this is a question of values. For the Christian apologist, the magisterial use of reason is a smokescreen. The real reason they will not come to atheism is that they love the darkness of blind evangelism rather than the light of being guided by reason. There can be no persuasion of such a person so long as that is true. They must come to value reason as we value it. They must have the courage that we have to allow their worldview to be judged by reason and to abide by the verdict of that judge, not necessarily by giving up their worldview, but by admitting that their worldview is held for reasons that an objective person would find unreasonable. If they are not willing to do this, then you are wasting your time. And remember, one of the key axioms of our approach is that life is short. This is how ministerial reason can serve the cause of atheism, by tempting the believer to transcend his own use of ministerial reason. What then should be our approach in counter-apologetics? It should be something like this. My friend, I have heard the arguments, I have heard the testimonies, and I have concluded that God does not exist. And if you use your reason consistently and courageously, you can come to the same conclusion that I did. Now, if you want to discuss your arguments for God, I'll give you some reasons for rejecting them that I really find convincing. But should my reasons seem weak and unconvincing to you, that only means that there is a disconnect between my conclusions and my ability to demonstrate those conclusions to your satisfaction. It does not mean that God exists, nor that your arguments succeed. Ultimately, you are accountable neither to me nor to God, but to your own values. You see, I use reason to support and flesh out my worldview. But when necessary, I value reason enough to let it stand in judgment over that same worldview. Can you say the same? If you like this video and want to help my channel grow, please hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. And if you want to share your thoughts on Martin Luther and William Lane Craig's uses and abuses of reason, leave a comment below. As always, I am so grateful that you decided to join me today, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. I'm David John Wellman, and the rest is up to you.